Presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if I might beg the indulgence of the House to make an introduction.
Please do.
Some special guests in here in your chamber, in the Speaker's gallery, Mr. Speaker, and we have some very distinguished members of the Red Hat Society who are joining us here this morning, and I would ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House. I even pulled out my red tie today, Mr. Speaker, for the occasion. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today has been proclaimed the 10th anniversary of the Red Hat Society, and whereas Nova Scotia now has more than 3,000 members in this unique women's disorganization through over 150 registered chapters across our province, adorning red hats and purple outfits and simply enjoying life over 50, and whereas born out of an idea of a few American women from the poem Warning by Jenny Joseph, the red and purple have come to symbolize a need for fun, frivolity, and a basic tenet: remember to enjoy life. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate women here in Nova Scotia and worldwide for promoting one of life's necessary prescriptions, a mixture of fun and camaraderie, a cure for many life's ills. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. Are you ready for the question? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the week of April 20th to 26th is Foster Family Recruitment Week in Nova Scotia, and foster care recruitment teams are working across the province to raise awareness about the rewards of fostering a child or youth. And whereas in Nova Scotia, foster parents work as part of a team of professionals to ensure children and youth receive the love and support they need. And whereas Nova Scotia is committed to attracting and training caring families who can help children and youth, and that Nova Scotia has made great strides in recruiting and retaining foster parents in recent years with significant success. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House commend Nova Scotia's existing foster families and encourage more families to open their hearts and homes to children in need. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
I got one. Sorry for that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Tuesday, April 1st was the first day of the new sports fishing season in Nova Scotia, and anglers were able to head out to their favourite river or lake in an attempt to catch the big one. And whereas sport fishing is an outdoor activity that can be enjoyed by family and friends and people of all ages, and bring significant economic benefit to the province. And whereas more than 100,000 anglers participate in license-free weekends, fishing derbies, learn-to-fish programs for children, and becoming an outdoor swimming program each year. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House encourage more Nova Scotians to try sport fishing during our license-free weekend on June 7th and 8th, as we are fortunate to have an abundance of angling opportunities. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
The adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia farmer Bill McCurdy of Old Barns, Colchester County, has been honored for his outstanding contribution to soil conservation in Canada and is the newest inductee into the Canadian Conservation Hall of Fame. And whereas this award recognizes the dedication and commitment of leaders in soil and water conservation, and Mr. McCurdy is a pioneer in the use of zero-till farming practices in Nova Scotia. And whereas Mr. McCurdy has been a member and director of the Soil Conservation Council of Canada, as well as served on many other agriculture-related boards, both provincially and nationally, including president of the Nova Scotia Milk Producers Association. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this legislature congratulate Mr. McCurdy on his award and recognize his leadership in his community and in the agriculture industry. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of African Nova Scotia Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a book detailing the history of African Nova Scotians in Cape Breton entitled One God, One Aim, One Destiny, African Nova Scotians in Cape Breton was launched as part of African Heritage Month in February of 2008. Whereas the book is an important documentation of African Nova Scotian history in this region, beginning with the arrival at Louisbourg of a small group of enslaved Africans and ending with the appointment of an African Nova Scotian from Whitney Pier to the position of Lieutenant Governor for Nova Scotia. And whereas the proceeds from the sale of this book will go to support key African Nova Scotian facilities in the region, the Glace Bay Universal Negro Improvement Association Hall and a museum in Glace Bay, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating the participants who shared their stories and the publisher for making this book a reality. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dr. John Calder, a geologist for more than 30 years with the Department of Natural Resources, has been a driving force behind the development of the Joggins Fossil Cliffs and their nomination as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And whereas Dr. Calder has worked tirelessly and given much of his personal time to provide special knowledge of the coal age and its life to the development of the displays at the recently opened Joggins Fossil Cliffs Centre. And whereas, due to an unfortunate coincidence of timing, he was unable to attend the opening of that great new Fossil Cliffs Centre on Monday, April the 21st. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House take a moment to show Nova Scotia's appreciation for the energy, passion, and commitment Dr. John Calder has shown in helping to bring the world's attention to our unique and spectacular natural assets. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas David Witherley has been long-standing regional librarian of the Annapolis Valley Regional Library, and whereas he has worked diligently to provide the best service possible to the residents of Hants, Kings, and Annapolis counties through the mobile library and branch locations, and whereas he has recently retired as regional librarian after 35 years of dedication to public libraries in Nova Scotia, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House extend best wishes to David Witherley on his retirement and thank him for his leadership and dedication to the Annapolis Valley Regional Library Program. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas farming is a physically demanding occupation and farmers must make the health and safety of the workers a priority. And whereas the Canadian Agriculture Safety Association and the Canadian Federation of Agriculture organize an annual farm safety awareness campaign across Canada that is aimed at improving safety on the farm, which was held from March 12th to the 18th. And whereas the theme of 2008 is manage more than just your back, which encouraged farmers to focus on ways to lower the risk of sprains and strains and falls on the job. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this legislature recognize the efforts of our local Farm Safety Committee as they promote safety on the farm throughout the year in Nova Scotia and congratulate them for hosting one of 2 Canadian Agriculture Safety Weeks events. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And if I may, to do an introduction to start off.
Please do.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce in the East Gallery Mr. Alan Stern, QC from McGinnis Cooper. He's also representing the Psychologist Board of Examiners. I'll ask Alan to stand and receive the warm welcome to the House. Very supportive of the bill that I'm introducing. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Protection of Confidential Disciplinary Proceedings of Health Professions.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Protection of Confidential Disciplinary Proceedings of Health Professionals.
Bill 127, entitled An Act Respecting the Protection of Confidential Disciplinary Proceedings of Health Professions.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
To table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 92 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Consumer Protection Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 92 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Consumer Protection Act.
Bill 128, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 92 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Consumer Protection Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 475 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Trade Union Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 475 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Trade Union Act.
Bill 129, titled An Act to Amend Chapter 475 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Trade Union Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Before I introduce this one, I just want to thank the member for Cumberland South for his input on this bill. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 2005, the Emergency Health Services Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 2005, the Emergency Health Services Act.
Bill numbered 130, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 2005, the Emergency Health Services Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Implement the North American Agreement on Labour Cooperation.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Implement the North American Agreement on Labour Cooperation.
Bill 131, entitled An Act to Implement the North American Agreement on Labour Cooperation.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my colleague from Halifax, Clayton Park, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 365 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Provincial Finance Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 365 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Provincial Finance Act.
Bill 132, an act entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 365 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Provincial Finance Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable, the Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, and before introducing this bill, I'm wondering if I'd be allowed to make a couple of introductions.
Please do.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased that today we have Mr. Fred Hutchinson, the Executive Director of the Association of Nova Scotia Land Surveyors, and Bruce McQuarrie, the Department of Natural Resources Director of Surveys, here in the audience. I just wonder if they would stand and accept the warm greetings of the House. And Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill called An Act to Amend Chapter 249 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Land Surveyors Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 249 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Land Surveyors Act.
Bill 133, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 249 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Land Surveyors Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to bring to the attention of the members of a young lady who's in the East Gallery today, Jennifer Calder, who's doing a 3-week-long practicum with the Legislative Library here, and as she works towards her Master's of Library and Information Studies at Dalhousie University. Jennifer's the daughter of Dan and Sherry Calder of Spring Hill. Dan's a school teacher and Mom's a healthcare worker. And I'd ask Sherry to stand and receive the warm welcome of the House. Jennifer, please.
The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapters 8 of the Acts of 2002, the Guardianship Act.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 8 of the Acts of 2002, the Guardianship Act.
Bill 134, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 8 of the Acts of 2002, the Guardianship Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. Orders of the day. The Honourable, the Government House Leader. Oh, notices of motion. Sorry, just a little anxious. Long drive to Cape Breton. Okay. Notices of motion. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Government and General Employees Union is celebrating 50 years of being a strong voice for organized labour in our province, and whereas the NSGEU will be celebrating the victories and achievements of its members with a series of special events, and whereas the NSGEU continues to make a difference in the lives of workers, their communities, and labour conditions in Nova Scotia, therefore be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate the NSGEU on their 50th anniversary and wish them well in the years to come. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the walls of Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy have had a piece of Queens County history painted on the walls of their school, and whereas the painting recognizes the sporting accomplishments of Terrence Tiger Warrington, Canadian light heavyweight and heavyweight champion from 1937 to 1940. And whereas a program support worker at Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy took 17 hours to complete the mural and then celebrated the unveiling of the mural with members of Terrence Warrington's family, including his grandson, a student at the Academy. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize Alta Mason of Liverpool for painting the mural at Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy, promoting cultural diversity in our community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the West Hants Midget A Warriors hockey team played in the provincial championship tournament for their category, finishing a 1-2-1 record in Clare. And whereas West Hants defeated Cape Breton West and tied Tacit 2-2 but lost to Truro, and 8-2 to the eventual provincial champions and the host team Clare. And whereas the Midget A team from West Hants was under the direction of head coach Morris Harvey and assistant Terry Hines. Therefore, be it resolved, MLAs in this legislature applaud the West Hants Midget A Warriors for a tremendous hockey season in 2007-08 and wishing the coaching staff and all players continued success and another great year in 2008-09. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Sandy Wickens of Bear Point, Shelburne County has volunteered in his community for over 40 years, and whereas Sandy coached baseball, and hockey for 40 years for such teams as the Woods Harbor Whalers, the Sable Fishpackers, the Newelton Dogtowners, and among many others. And whereas even after undergoing a kidney transplant in 1996, Sandy continued to coach up until 6 years ago after losing his eyesight due to a virus contracted during a kidney transplant. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize Sandy for volunteering in his community for over 40 years and commend his dedication to coaching and his unwavering good nature in the face of great physical difficulties. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Chief Terry Powell of the Member 2 First Nation has been appointed to the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board, and whereas on this board, representatives of regions throughout the country advise members on policy, programming, and program coordination matters related to Aboriginal economic development, and whereas with Chief Powell's leadership experience, he will definitely be an asset to this committee and will be a strong voice for Aboriginal people throughout this province and our region. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate Chief Terry Powell on his appointment to the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board and wish him all the best as he takes on this additional role. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in September of last year, the 55-plus club in New Glasgow made the hard decision to not accept any new applications for membership for 1 year. Whereas the popular social and recreational club has been bursting at the seams as its membership list continues to grow and the popularity of its programs increase. Whereas club administrators maintain that the effective organization and friendly attitude make it a popular outlet in the community, and that providing a place for people to meet and connect is an integral part of any community. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send their congratulations to the members and administrators of the 55 Plus Club in New Glasgow for providing and maintaining such a popular community gathering place, an important part of any Nova Scotia community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Monday, January the 21st, 2008, Riverview Adult Residential Home experienced an emergency situation that staff responded to with terrific speed and memorable compassion. And whereas members of the Plymouth, Eureka, and Stellarton Fire Departments, auxiliaries, and community volunteers turned out to comfort the men and women evacuated from Riverview when the sprinkler system malfunctioned. And whereas the first evening found volunteers readying cots provided by the Canadian Red Cross, leaving homes early on subsequent mornings to cook and serve breakfast, preparing lunch, and often returning after a day's work to prepare supper. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly commend the staff of Riverview and the volunteers of fire departments, auxiliaries, and members of the communities of Plymouth, Eureka, and Stellarton for their hard work and kind words as they help the residents of Riverview during and after the evacuation. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Richmond.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday in this House, the Leader of the Opposition decided to take a swipe at former New Brunswick Premier Frank McKenna. And where it is not unlike the Leader of the Opposition and his party to make statements which only tell the part of the story which satisfies their prerogative. And whereas while Frank McKenna did suggest that consumption taxes could be increased, he also stated that the region should then use, quote, that money to reduce corporate taxes and capital taxes and make this region the most competitive region in Canada and in North America to do business, end quote, something the NDP is obviously opposed to. Therefore, be it resolved that the Leader of the Opposition read the whole news article and not just the headline.
The motion is tabled. The Honourable, the member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas former Bredor Elementary student Natasha McGee continues to raise money for an elementary school in Pictou County, school student in Pictou County with muscular dystrophy, after hearing about a local restaurant's efforts to do the same last year. And whereas McGee started collecting tabs from aluminum cans when she was a pupil at the school, and made a trip back this year to promote the project to new students and encourage collection in the hopes of securing a new wheelchair for Trenton Elementary School student Daniel Ersnow. And whereas McGee has already collected more than 40,000 tabs that will be eventually melted down and used in the construction of wheelchairs. Proceeds from the tabs are deposited into a bank account in Ersnow's name. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House send their utmost congratulations to 7th grade student Natasha McGee on her continued effort to raise money for Daniel Ersnow, and in doing so, demonstrating the best of Nova Scotia's values and principles. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Silver Sands Conservation Society is a not-for-profit community organization which was formed in 1999 and incorporated in February 2000, and the Silver Sands Conservation Society provides a voice for the Silver Sands Beach in Cow Bay, Nova Scotia, which is an environmentally sensitive beach that has suffered much damage in the 1950s when the sand was hauled away for regional construction projects, And whereas the Silver Sands Conservation Society maintains the site of the historic Cow Bay Moose statue, which is a scenic gathering stop for local residents and visitors to the area. And whereas Silver Sands Beach Park, after many years of neglect, has achieved shoreline stabilization, is now being developed into a park to celebrate the natural views and the rich history of the area. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly acknowledge the efforts of the Silver Sands Conservation Society for their conservation and preservation initiatives and encourage and support their future efforts. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Richmond.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Parkinson's is a debilitating disease that affects over 100,000 Canadians, whereas recent estimates predict that the number of people diagnosed with Parkinson's will increase twofold within the next 20 years. Whereas the Parkinson's Society Canada will recognize April as Parkinson's Awareness Month by introducing their new campaign, quote, "Nothing's easy when your body turns against you," end quote, and by selling tulips in support of research, education, advocacy, and support services. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize April as Parkinson's Awareness Month and work together to raise awareness of this illness and to help find a cure. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas acclaimed performing artists, the Barra McNeils, are more than just family, they're best friends, and whereas more family members have joined the group over the years, adding to their talent and recording success, and whereas for 2 decades they have provided endless hours of entertainment to the world, drawing on their proud Cape Breton roots, therefore be resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating the Barra McNeils on their 20th anniversary and wish them many more years of recording success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Nova Scotia has been a major contributor to the arts community of our province, and whereas their history, Symphony Nova Scotia has given over 1,000 performing for more than 1 million people, and whereas as part of their 25th anniversary season, a number of special guest artists will join the orchestra to provide an extraordinary series of performances destined to make this milestone memorable. Therefore, be resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize the vast contribution that Symphony Nova Scotia has made on the arts community of our province and congratulate them on their 25th anniversary season. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Warren and Mona Legg, owners of A.J. Walker & Son Limited, received the 2007 Business Achievement Award from the Truro and District Chamber of Commerce. Whereas A.J. Walker & Son has been operating for 118 years and has been owned by the Legg family since 1931, when Warren's grandfather purchased the business. Whereas Warren and Mona Legg have been leaders in the broader community as well as the business community. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Warren and Mona Legg, owners of A.J. Walker & Son Limited, on receiving the 2007 Business Achievement Award from the Truro and District Chamber of Commerce, and thank them for their leadership in the broader community and wish them well in their business continued success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year hundreds of thousands of people visit our province while voyaging the seas on a cruise ship. And whereas cruise ships provide a much needed boost to the tourism industry and local economy of Nova Scotia. And whereas this year we'll see the largest number of cruise ships visit, with 131 vessels scheduled to visit Halifax and 50 scheduled to dock at the Port of Sydney. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly recognize the important role that cruise ships play in the tourism industry and welcome all the cruise ship passengers to our fair province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Antigonish Midget Female Bulldogs won their third consecutive Nova Scotia provincial hockey title, and whereas the Midget Bulldogs accomplished the feat in dramatic fashion, overcoming a 2-1 third period deficit to defeat the Western Valley 4-2, and whereas Aaron Brophy, team captain, was named top forward of the tournament, scored the winning goal, and had 7 goals and 2 assists in the tournament. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House join me in congratulating the Antigonish Midget Female Bulldogs on winning their third consecutive Nova Scotia provincial hockey title. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on the future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 1 in 4 Nova Scotians are affected by arthritis, and whereas the Kingston Volunteer Fire Department are working with Joints in Motion to help raise money to find a cure for arthritis, and whereas through a series of fundraising events, the volunteer firefighters hope to raise $40,000 to help those in need. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate the Kingston Volunteer Firefighters and offer them best wishes for future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers are people from all walks of life and all ages with a common desire to make a difference in their community and in their own life by giving of their time and expertise. And whereas volunteers in Bedford are the lifeblood of the communities, providing support in virtually every aspect of society, including health, education, social services, youth, sports, recreation, culture, the arts, and the environment. Whereas Gloria Lothar was named by the Northwest Planning Advisory Committee of Bedford Volunteer of the Year for her selfless act of giving to the community. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the invaluable efforts made by all volunteers in their communities and congratulate Gloria Lothar on her contribution to the Northwest Planning Advisory Committee and the people of Bedford. Mr. Speaker, I'd request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Provincial Volunteer Awards ceremony took place April 24th at the Westin in Halifax, and whereas this ceremony recognizes individuals from across Nova Scotia who have made significant contributions to their community through volunteering, and whereas the 2008 recipient from the town of Berwick is Florence Carter, who has contributed her talent and time to her church, Red Cross, Food Bank, and many other organizations. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate Florence Carter of Berwick and wish her continued success in future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Canada Post is presently undertaking a 3-year review concerning the future of the delivery of 843,000 rural mailboxes in Canada, and where rural delivery is something that was established back in 1693. And whereas Canada Post is insisting it is committed to maintaining delivery to rural mailboxes, with the only change being is one of last resort. And whereas with Canada Post maintaining it is committed to rural delivery and change will only come as the very last resort, therefore it be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly acknowledge the review presently underway regarding rural delivery by Canada Post, and through this resolution request Canada Post officials recognize that while community mailbox works sometimes, other individuals must be protected and ensure mail delivery service because they are unable to depend on family members. They could be injured or the weather, which could keep keys from being turned at mailbox for a number of days. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Kind of long. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day. I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the second annual celebration of service for Colchester County's first responders was held at the Immaculate Conception Church in Truro on April 20th, 2008, and whereas the celebration of service was an ecumenical service organized by the Knights of Columbus to recognize and thank first responders for the contributions they make to the residents of Colchester County. And whereas there are 25 first responder organizations in Colchester County consisting of 911, Fire, Police, Canadian Forces, Emergency Health, Special Hazards, Ground Search and Rescue, and Conservation personnel, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate and thank the Knights of Columbus of the Immaculate Conception Church in Truro for organizing the celebration of service to honor and celebrate the contribution of Colchester County's first responders. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Colchester North has many dedicated volunteers who willingly give of their time and talents to help others and benefit their communities, and whereas Susan Bartlett of Crows Mills, a loyal supporter of the Truro and District Lions Club, in her role as liaison between the club and the Navy Cadet League, helped coordinate a food bank drive during Christmas as well as public speaking competitions in our schools, and whereas Susan is also preparing for an event, a fundraiser event which places a dog with a hearing impaired, vision impaired, and special needs recipient, and has been chosen as chairwoman of the Multi-District Conference for Lions members in the Atlantic Provinces. Therefore be it resolved, all members of this House congratulate Susan for being recognized as a deserving Volunteer of the Week. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas City Mines resident Brittany Burton aced the provincial hairdressing licensing exam, and whereas Brittany, who received her training at Memorial Composite High School in City Mines, took the top mark in the province for theory and practical at 95%, and whereas Brittany is now pursuing her career at a local hair design business, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in sending congratulations to Brittany Burton on her accomplishment and future career endeavours. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Orders of the day. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call to the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 124, the Administration of Justice Act?
Bill 124, the Administration of Justice Act. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll continue with this, and I'm very pleased to rise and speak to Bill 124. Indeed, which we identify as a housekeeping bill for various components that are required, but nonetheless are all significant, Mr. Speaker, to their various applications, and that is why I am pleased to be here today on second reading of the Justice Administration Act amendments. This bill contains, as I said, mainly housekeeping amendments to existing legislation. And a summary of the various amendments is as follows, and I know, Mr. Speaker, there may be components that some of my colleagues, as it affects their portfolio, may wish to speak to a little later, and I look forward to the debate that ensues. But however, included will be amendments to the Summary Proceedings Act, Mr. Speaker, that will give justices of the peace the authority to set aside an automatic conviction for failure to appear in court on a summary offence matter. Previously, only provincial court judges could perform this function. By allowing justices of the peace to do this, Mr. Speaker, we hope to shorten the processing time with regards to all summary offence cases. Mr. Speaker, amendments to the Agriculture and Marketing Act and the Bee Industry Act will allow the Minister of Agriculture to delegate to department staff the authority for issuing licenses and permits. For example, a license to farm minks. This change will allow for a quicker turnaround time in terms of obtaining these permits and licenses. Mr. Speaker, changes to the Small Claims Court Act will clarify amendments made to this act last year. Claims for general damages in small claims court have been increased from $100 to $2,500. The amendments introduced as part of yesterday in this act will ensure that this increase is reflected throughout the Small Claims Court Act. Amendments to the Companies Act will clarify the type of resolution needed by newly amalgamated companies that wish to adopt articles. The adoption of articles will now require a special resolution as opposed to a regular resolution. A special resolution is a resolution surrounding a fundamental change to the organization. A regular resolution would surround an operational change. A special resolution requires the agreement of 2/3 of shareholders, while a regular resolution requires only majority agreement to pass. In addition, Mr. Speaker, changes to the Consumer Reporting Act will enable Nova Scotians to have expanded access, including online access to their credit information. And this, Mr. Speaker, is something that I know consumers, as they do their planning on an annual basis, is important to them, but ability to get online at least once a year, free of charge, to have access to their credit information when they're making important household and life decisions, that they'll have the ability to do that unimpeded with a service fee. Mr. Speaker, amendments to the Public Trustee Act will allow the authority of the public trustee to extend beyond an individual's discharge from hospital or the termination for whatever reason of an adult protection order. Mr. Speaker, this has been the practice in common law for years now, and we simply wish to have it recognized in the legislation. The amendments will also permit the public trustee to delegate some duties to the staff of the Office of the Public Trustee. As I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, we talk about these as being housekeeping items, but indeed they are significant and the implications are very important to the respective interest groups and the application of these in law. And finally, Mr. Speaker, administrative changes to the Public Service Act will update the names or mandates of existing departments, repeal obsolete provisions, and update the list of the Ministers in the Executive Council Act. So, Mr. Speaker, that is a summary of what's included in Bill 124, the Administration of Justice Act. And again, I know some of my colleagues may want to elaborate further on the impact in their own portfolio, but I also welcome the feedback of the House. And I do believe, Mr. Speaker, when we say housekeeping changes, we do want to make sure that people are aware and offer debate, because there may be a particular component of this that members of the House feel a need to respond to and address, and we welcome that debate here in the Chamber. And I look forward to Bill 124 proceeding with debate and the intercessions from my colleagues in the House. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Premier on an introduction.
Speaker, thank you to my colleague for giving a moment of time. Mr. Speaker, in the East Gallery, we have a gentleman from my own riding here today with us. He's from the community of Mabou, or actually in the general area of Mabou, and does many things in our community on behalf of the community. One of them is making sure that
our local arenas is well looked after for our young people.
Very important.
Mr. Speaker, and I would ask Jeff Lee to stand up and receive the warm welcome of the House.
The Honourable Member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do welcome that gentleman from Mabu. I know that was a good rink, and a rink that I've played in. In fact, there's probably a few old NHLers who might have been there in the past. So keep up the good work with that facility in your community, sir. On a hockey note, I suppose I should start off by congratulating and thanking the Montreal Canadiens last night, because in the midst of me reading this housekeeping bill, at least the hockey game was exciting enough to keep me awake. Because I can tell you, when I get a bill of this nature and I look at what's included in it, it's an omnibus bill. It includes a lot of really housekeeping issues. But as the minister said, it also includes a number of significant, important pieces of legislation that should be brought in to stand alone. And I will come to those individual concerns in a moment, Mr. Speaker. I mean, we're talking about changing the names of departments. We're talking about expanding the responsibilities when it comes to delegating for licenses and permits for the bee industry and other such important pieces of legislation. I can see those included in this sort of omnibus bill. They are housekeeping matters, but in the midst of all these other issues that are included, there are some salient features which I'd like to bring to the House's attention, and hopefully when this bill proceeds through the House, with comments from those members present who would like to have comments. We'll also draw attention to the fact that there are some salient pieces of legislation here that if they're that important, they should be included on their own. They should be in the order paper on their own merit and their own strength. Those are the sorts of things that I'm sure would attract interest from various Nova Scotians, various interest groups who will be concerned about, well, if this is such an important thing when we look at the Consumer Reporting Act, and these changes have been suggested, why doesn't the Consumer Reporting Act and these changes stand on its own and be brought in as an individual piece of legislation? So as I went through this bill last night and I looked at the changes that are coming forth, many of these things are playing catch up when it comes to administrative changes. It's fine to have them in this legislation. However, and there's always a however, of course, I want to point out that there are some important parts here that we should pay some significant attention to. And I know, Mr. Speaker, at this stage of the bill, I'm not allowed to refer to particular clauses or specifics. I have to keep it general when we look at the debate that's taking place. But if I may, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw the attention of the House to that section of the bill dealing with the Public Trustees Act. The Public Trustees Act is of some consequence when you look at the delegation of authority that has been suggested here. This is an important piece of legislation, and a piece of legislation that we should be debating on its merit, and then when people appear in front of law amendments, they would talk to that bill in itself, not the inclusion of Section 8 of a bill, but the bill in itself should be allowed to stand on its own. When we look at the Public Trustees Act and the changes that are made, when we look at particularly one clause, I know I'm not allowed to number the clause, but I can tell you it's the same number that Bob Gainey used to wear when he played for the Montreal Canadiens. I want members very clearly to look at that particular clause. That particular clause, Mr. Speaker, is something that we should be looking at individually and specifically and debating the merits or the demerits of that particular part of the Public Trustees Act. But here it is included in an omnibus bill, which includes all kinds of other administrative things of some consequence for departments opposite. But when we look at the Public Trustees Act, I would hope that this government would have introduced that as a separate piece of legislation so that those interested, when they appear in front of law amendments, will be able to discuss that particular clause. And I note for those members of the public who might be listening or watching or reading Hansard, they should look at that clause that's named after Bob Gainey's number when he played for the Canadiens. There's also a catch-up part to the legislation with the Small Claims Court Act. The Small Claims Court Act, a change that necessarily had to be made because of previous legislation. But if that's such a consequential and significant part of this bill, that particular piece of legislation should be introduced so that we can debate and stand on that itself and not have it included as one of the sort of add-ons at the very end of the bill, incidentally, Mr. Speaker.
If I had begun the reading of the bill last evening in front of the hockey game, perhaps I should have started at the back and moved towards the front, because there's more important legislation in my view, although the B Act is important, the B industry is important, the delegation of those responsibilities are important, but those are administrative housekeeping acts. And that would not be controversial in any way. But when we look at the Small Claims Court Act and the add-on line that's included in the very last page of this particular bill, that's another act that, in my opinion, should stand on its own. And I heard the minister mention, and I appreciate him drawing attention to the fact that amidst all the other administrative changes that are being recommended here, he also mentioned the Summary Proceedings Act. The Summary Proceedings Act is an important piece of legislation. It deals with that issue when people fail to appear and how it causes backups in our courts. A significant, important change that this caucus is certainly willing to look at on its merit. But it's part of this omnibus bill again. And if this is such a significant, important, and I believe it is, the Summary Proceedings Act, if this is such a significant and important piece of legislation, why aren't we talking about it on its own? Why aren't we debating its merits and its demerits, as I've suggested with a couple of other informations here? I look particularly, however, and I draw the attention of the House to that section of the bill, and I won't number it again, I promise. I can't remember the number, and I can't remember the NHL hockey player that it would be numbered after. But the Consumer Reporting Act and the disclosure of information. This is an important piece of legislation. When we look at the Consumer Reporting Act and this particular change, a change personally that I think that has been a long time in coming, that particular change is welcome. But if it's such a significant and important change, how come we are discussing it in the midst of all the other things that are in Bill 124? Bill 124 includes a lot of housekeeping items that we can very quickly take care of and tidy up some of the loose ends when it comes to administration, the renaming of responsibilities, the looking at the Office of Gallic Affairs, etc., all housekeeping matters. But in the middle of all those housekeeping issues, there are certain salient points that I believe should have been allowed to stand on their own. The Public Trustees Act in particular, the Small Claims Court Act, the Summary Proceedings Act, the Consumer Reporting Act. Those all should have been brought in on their own so that we and the critics involved could have clearly looked at that legislation, looked at its values, looked at what people are going to say when they appear in front of law amendments. You know, we attract people to come to law amendments because of the issues that they are interested in. People have to be paying very close attention to Bill 124 when the title says it's an act respecting the administration of justice. An act dealing with respecting the administration of justice. And then when you look at all the things that are included in this omnibus bill, when you look at all the housekeeping matters that are included, in the midst of it, we have some really salient points that should be discussed and debated on the floor of this legislature. So I encourage Nova Scotians to pay attention to Bill 124, to look particularly at some of the issues that we're going to bring forward with regards to the Public Trustees Act in particular, the Small Claims Court Act, the Summary Proceedings Act, and the Consumer Reporting Act, all important issues for Nova Scotians. With those comments, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my place. I thank you for your patience today, particularly when I have to make attention or draw attention to Bob Gainey's number 23. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's with a sense of mixed emotions, I rise to speak on Bill number 124, the Justice Administration Act. And I know that the former Minister of Justice, now the Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure, Renewal, will be reminded of the many occasions I have in the past 9 years, I believe, lamented the Justice Administration Act. And I know that my former colleague, former member from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, would join me in that criticism of the fact that back previously you did have Justice Administration Acts being brought in that had significant changes included in the omnibus bill. And it was of great concern to us, and unfortunately under a majority government situation we had very little power to do anything about it. But Mr. Speaker, as we all know, we find ourselves in a minority government situation now, and I did listen very carefully to remarks made by the justice critic of the NDP, and would certainly signal to him that if it is his intention, based on his comments, to see that this bill be severed in separate parts, it is certainly something that I would be prepared to entertain and force the government, rather than putting all of these changes in one bill, to bring in separate pieces of legislation. So I certainly would signal right off the bat my willingness to look at that and make it easier for us as parliamentarians and for Nova Scotians to understand some of the changes which are contained in this Act. As has been pointed out by the Minister, this Act does make a number of administrative type changes. Unfortunately, we find ourselves again, legislation that was passed either last spring or last fall is being brought back to this House to make corrections due to errors when the bill was initially brought forward. So again, to err is human, but certainly, Mr. Speaker, this has become a yearly exercise. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, last year we had 2 Justice Administration Acts, A and B, both in the spring session and fall session, so it was a real big year for Justice Administration Acts last year. Mr. Speaker, as has been said, our role as elected officials on behalf of Nova Scotians is to be able to debate legislation, explain to them the impact that legislation is going to have or may not have, and make sure that at the end of the day when we're voting on this, that there's a clear understanding what we're being asked to support. And again, this is a bill where there are some relatively minor changes, but there are some significant changes which are taking place as well. Speaker, when we spoke about the changes to the Small Claims Court last session, we did talk about increasing the general damages to $2,500, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, that wasn't reflected in the legislation, or the proper language wasn't used at the time. But the Small Claims Court, again, Mr. Speaker, I've asked on numerous occasions here in this House and outside of this House, we have been making significant changes to the Small Claims Court, especially in the dollar value that one can bring the matters to this court. And I've always had a concern that this was going to have an impact on our adjudicators throughout the province, in the fact that you're going to start seeing much more complex legal matters appearing in front of that court. The Small Claims Court was initially set up to be a means of Nova Scotians to be able to have their relatively minor matters heard in a court which was less formal than our traditional court system. But, Mr. Speaker, by moving the limit of the Small Claims Court up to $20,000, there is no doubt that we are now seeing lawyers representing the parties at Small Claims Court, and is getting a much more formal court than what I believe may have been initially intended. And one of the questions I asked, Mr. Speaker, was whether the adjudicators throughout Nova Scotia had been given the opportunity to make comment on these changes and the impact of these changes. And I've asked the Minister, both current and previous, to indicate to us as to whether these changes in the income limit for Small Claims Court is having a positive effect or adverse effect, and what changes might we want to look at as a result. And unfortunately, to date, I've still yet to get any correspondence from the Minister of Justice indicating as to whether there has been discussions with adjudicators or if they've been given the opportunity to make comment on these changes. So unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, as an elected official, I'm still not in a position to be able to indicate whether these changes have been positive or whether there's any further review required as a result of it. Mr. Speaker, I believe that there has been mention about the specific changes that are included in this bill, but as has been mentioned on second reading, there's quite a bit of latitude that is allowed when it comes to what we can discuss. And when one looks at the title of this bill, the Justice Administration Act, then that certainly gives us the opportunity to discuss a whole host of issues relating to justice. And Mr. Speaker, one of the issues which are most pressing for Nova Scotians today is the issue with our correctional facilities here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, this is a government which, under John Ham, after being elected in 1999, in the years 2000-2001, closed rural jails throughout Nova Scotia. Now, at the time, they said that the jails were outdated, they weren't modern enough, they didn't meet the needs of the correctional services, and they closed those jails. Now, Mr. Speaker, this had certainly had an economic impact on those communities. This is the same government that closed rural courthouses throughout Nova Scotia. I know in my community of St. Peter's, the Lions Hall, which was held as a court was closed due to the Conservative government's decisions, and that certainly had a negative financial impact on that facility as well. But Mr. Speaker, when the government closed these rural jails, they basically lost, I believe it's 148 cells. So it's 148 cells that were taken out of the system. Now, one would think that the government would say, here's our plan to replace those cells and to build new cells, modern ones and everything else. That was back in 2000, 2001. Now here we are in 2008, there are no new cells. And lo and behold, we don't have enough cells to deal with the amount of inmates that we have here in Nova Scotia. So what's the government's solution? They built a new correctional facility in Yarmouth. They said this facility can now hold, I believe it's 76 inmates. This is what it is designed to hold. Yet lo and behold, the government announces a couple of weeks ago that this facility can now hold over 150 inmates, rather than the previous 76 that it had been built for. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians may not have a great deal of sympathy for inmates in this province, but I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotians have a tremendous amount of respect for the men and women and the staff that work in the correctional facilities of Nova Scotia. This government has found itself once again without a plan. They found themselves again dealing with a crisis situation. And one has to ask, well, they closed the jails in the year 2000, 2001. One would think that they would start to work on a plan at that time, but maybe they forgot about it. Very busy or busy government, maybe they forgot about it. But then we had Fred Hansberger here at Public Accounts Committee, and when I put the question to him, when did you start indicating to the government that there was a need for new facilities in Nova Scotia? And the answer, he said 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, he started indicating to this government and to the Minister of Justice there was a need for new correctional facilities in Nova Scotia. And yet, here we are, it's 2008, we're in April, there is still no construction of new correctional facilities in our province. Yet, Mr. Speaker, if this was an issue, if justice was an issue that we'd say the government hasn't really paid much attention to, in many ways I feel they haven't paid much attention to, but one thing they have done is they've talked a lot. And in every platform, it's been justice. It's been getting tough on crime, safer streets. In 1999, 2003, 2006, they were all major elements of the Tory election platform. Yet here we are, without enough cells for inmates in Nova Scotia. And yet the Minister of Justice would say, well, we're a victim of success. We're such a great government. We've been so tough on crime. Who would have thought that we'd have all these inmates now? Yet we now know that the Director of Corrections 2 years ago was telling them we need new correctional facilities. I believe it's been suggested there's a need to replace the existing facility in Antigonish and a need for a new facility in northern Nova Scotia, maybe in the riding of the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. I'm not sure if they've gotten that specific yet. But the fact is, the other question I put to Mr. Hansberger, Mr. Speaker, was if the government committed today to build these new facilities, when could we expect them to be ready? And he very honestly answered, at least another couple of years. So here we are, Mr. Speaker, in a situation where we've had to have the Yarmouth Correctional Facility double its occupancy, and now the Burnside facility is being asked to double its occupancy as well. Now, one would think, Mr. Speaker, that prior to announcing this, the government would be able to say, and the Minister of Justice would be able to stand in his place and say, now, prior to making this announcement, here are the discussions that I've had with the correctional officers, here are the discussions I've had with the staff, here is the plan that we have to deal with double bunking of inmates, and here's our plan going forward. Yet once again, Mr. Speaker, this government just doesn't seem to get it, because they announced the double bunking for the Yarmouth Correctional Facility and Burnside, and then they said, we're now going to start speaking with the correctional officers as to how we're going to make this a reality. But when is the change effective? Immediately. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's just not the way to do business. I don't think any business person would operate in that fashion. Why should they expect that the government of Nova Scotia would be operating in that fashion? How is it that once again this government seems to lack the vision of being able to plan for the future and be able to tell Nova Scotians, here is what we want to do, here's how we're going to achieve it, and here are our partners that are with us in achieving this. And that's not the case. But Mr. Speaker, I believe that the government and the Premier has indicated that justice is going to be one of the main issues they want to discuss during the session. And I'm happy to hear that, because yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I tabled legislation as well, dealing with justice issues. And that legislation was something which I described yesterday, Mr. Speaker, as common sense. Here's the situation we have in Nova Scotia right now under this Conservative government. Correctional officers in Nova Scotia at both the Burnside facility and other facilities are trained that while they are inside the facility, they are trained to use batons and they are trained to use pepper spray, for example, while they're in the facility. Yet, Mr. Speaker, when they are transferring an inmate from the facility either to court or to a hospital or to any sort of an appointment, these correctional officers are not permitted to bring a baton or pepper spray with them. So they are left completely unarmed. Now, Mr. Speaker, if anyone can explain to me the logic as to why they would be permitted to use these items within the walls of the correctional facility, and yet we do not permit them to use it when they are transporting inmates, it remains a mystery to me, and which is why when we table that legislation, I hope the government will take the opportunity to look at it. But Mr. Speaker, we need to look at what we are asking from our correctional officers. We all know, as we speak, and this Minister of Justice has to put on his resume that he was the minister that had an inmate escape custody from Nova Scotia and who remains at large. Not something that many of us would want to add on our resume, but that's the reality. Mr. Carvery is still at large. We haven't heard the minister indicate any special efforts to locate him either. It almost appears to be that he's gone and that's it. But Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are very concerned that someone who is being charged with the crimes that Mr. Carvery was being charged with has managed to escape custody in Nova Scotia. That someone who was in handcuffs and leg shackles, leg irons, managed to escape custody in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I have to say that when I hear the minister and this government talk about safer streets, that certainly rings hollow when one looks at what happened in that case. We now know that somehow, and it appears the department was aware of this, that one could easily get out of leg irons with an apparatus to be able to trigger them and open them. Why is it? Why is it that if we had this knowledge, that this government would not have been more prudent, especially coming from a government which talks so often about justice and the need for safer streets? It's one thing, Mr. Speaker, to ask our police officers to do their work and to get these inmates, to get these individuals, to charge them, to get them in a correctional facility, and then for the province of Nova Scotia and for this government to lose them. But not only did they lose Mr. Carvery, Mr. Speaker, we now know that there was at least 3 other instances where inmates were permitted to walk away from correctional facilities. Whoops, walked away. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's one thing to happen once, it's one thing to happen twice, 3 times since 2008, and we're only in the month of April. There's still 8 more months to go. So, Mr. Speaker, what message does that send to Nova Scotians? So here we are after the escape of Mr. Carvery, and we're very fortunate in that case that no one was injured, because it could have very easily been a more unfortunate situation because of the fact that this individual was loose within the correctional services van, and that there could have been injury to the correctional services officers. And fortunately, that wasn't the case. But one would think that the minister would have immediately said, I now see where those 2 correctional officers were vulnerable, they were unarmed, and we need to address that. I need to show leadership, because Nova Scotians want to make sure the last thing is that our correctional officers are put in harm's way and don't have any means of defending themselves. Instead, the minister says, I'm going to get an audit done. An audit's the way to go, and the audit will report sometime in the fall.
And what do we do in the meantime? Apparently, under this minister, absolutely nothing. So, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, while the minister's touring the province speaking to chambers of commerce about the Youth Justice Act and changes he's pursuing, which all Nova Scotians have pretty much said they support, this House has already indicated its support, yet he still feels the need to try to go and see Nova Scotians. While he's touring the province, our correctional officers are being put in harm's way, and that's unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. It's completely unacceptable. And Nova Scotians should get better leadership from this minister and better leadership from this government. So what situation are we in now? Naturally, the correctional officers, and I don't blame them, when they are being asked to do transfers of inmates who are considered high risk, they are refusing. And that is their right to do so. If they feel that their safety is at risk, the laws of Nova Scotia under occupational health and safety give them the right to refuse that work. So what's the minister's answer? Does he say, well, okay, I need to find some way of addressing the concerns of correctional officers? His answer is, I'm going to bring in police officers. So here's a minister in a government that says, we're going to hire more police officers to put on the streets of Nova Scotia to make the streets safer, and rather than having them on the streets of Nova Scotia, we now have them doing inmate transfers and sitting with inmates at hospitals or at appointments or in court rather than be there protecting Nova Scotians on the streets. Mr. Speaker, it's become almost a farce what is happening in our correctional services. And again, I would point out it is a lack of leadership from the minister and it is a lack of direction from this government. And Mr. Speaker, I've said it to some of my colleagues and I will say it here in the House, that if the former Minister of Justice, who is now the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, were still the Minister of Justice today, there would not be inmates roaming free on the streets of Nova Scotia. Yet that is the situation that we have here in this province, Mr. Speaker. And hopefully the Premier will take the opportunity to reflect upon his decision and reflect upon whether it was wise of him to take out the former Minister of Justice, who clearly had justice issues at his core. It was part of his being. Everything about him screamed justice. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we do not see the same from the current minister, and I believe the Premier, I've said it before, should reflect upon his choice on that. But Mr. Speaker, I hear some of my colleagues saying I'm being a bit too tough, and maybe I am, but I have to tell you, when you see correctional officers coming to see our caucuses, and they tell you that, for example, in one of the facilities up in northern Nova Scotia, which is considered a low-risk facility, but yet still there could easily be an uprising or be some disorder in that facility. And you hear the correctional officers say they have one helmet, and that helmet had been used at some point to do some painting and is covered with paint. And you hear about some of the deficiencies and the basic equipment they're given to protect themselves. Mr. Speaker, it's an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment for our province. It is something that I cannot believe is being allowed to continue under a government which has talked so tough on crime here in this province. So, Mr. Speaker, I do hope that the minister, with this Justice Administration Act and having been given the opportunity to discuss justice issues in this House, will reflect on the fact that we in the Liberal caucus, and I believe even the NDP caucus, is asking for leadership. It's asking him to be able to put actions behind his great talk on getting tough on crime and safer streets in Nova Scotia. We need to have our police officers on the streets, not transporting inmates from correctional facilities to appointments. But to be able to do that and to be able to change that, the minister needs to be able to show leadership, talk to the correctional services officers, and find ways to address the concerns that they've pointed out. And Mr. Speaker, as we've pointed out, many other jurisdictions, for example, allow correctional officers to use sidearms when they are doing transfers. Now, Mr. Speaker, the minister immediately dismissed that suggestion, saying the last thing he wanted is for an inmate to turn a weapon on a correctional services officer. We all agree with that. But what does that say for our police officers, for our CMP officers? Why do we give them arms if that is the fear that we're using for correctional officers? Correctional officers properly trained in other jurisdictions have sidearms, and they use it for their protection and for the protection of the public. And why this government is waiting for an audit, a report in the fall, when they've seen some of the concerns that have happened around our correctional facilities, Mr. Speaker, I believe is unacceptable, because I believe there's a degree of common sense to these issues which one should never need an audit to be able to deal with common sense. So, Mr. Speaker, I do hope that during this session, the legislation that I've tabled and introduced in this House, that the Minister will reflect upon it, and that the Minister will be willing to work with all parties in this House to address some of the concerns around our correctional facilities. The budget is coming in on Tuesday. We'll have to wait and see whether there's any funding that's been set aside for new correctional facilities in this province. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't think any Nova Scotian believes that double bunking is the way to go. If this government is going to continue its talk on getting tough on crime, we have a duty to make sure we have the appropriate facilities to be able to meet that need. It rings hollow when you hear the minister, whether it's on the Youth Justice Act or on anything else, calling for longer sentences when we don't have anywhere to put inmates. It just doesn't work, Mr. Speaker. But that's going to take leadership, it's going to take some vision, and it's going to take an actual plan. And we await, Mr. Speaker, in this House to see what this minister's plan is and how we can move forward together as elected officials to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the justice system here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, as well as I mentioned with the Administration of Justice Act, it gives you such an opportunity to talk about justice issues in this province. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk on another topic which has been reported in the media, and which I believe it's important that Nova Scotians be made aware of. Mr. Speaker, it's an issue that not many Nova Scotians like to think of, and not many Nova Scotians spend much time reflecting on, and it may not even be a pleasant conversation for them to have. Mr. Speaker, it is something that we as elected officials need to address. And Mr. Speaker, it is the situation that exists in this province with our lack of proper facilities for morgues and for forensic science in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I do want to take the opportunity to commend the Minister of Justice for the leadership he showed in asking members from both the official opposition and from our caucus to join him in touring the forensic facility and the crime lab down in Miami. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that some members of the media immediately questioned whether this was an opportunity to get down to a sunny resort. Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. Mr. Speaker, we had the opportunity through the leadership of the Department of Justice and especially the leadership of our Chief Medical Examiner here in Nova Scotia, Dr. Matt Bowes, to be able to tour the facility that exists in Miami. Mr. Speaker, it is very important for us as legislators to be able to deal with a whole variety of issues. And under the leadership of the Chief Medical Examiner, under the support of the Department of Justice and the government, it was an issue of us having the opportunity as elected officials to see what type of facility is being used in Miami, which is considered one of the prototypes and is considered one of the leading educational institutions for forensic science and for the establishment of morgues throughout the world. Mr. Speaker, we went to that facility and we had the opportunity to see exactly what it looked like. Mr. Speaker, we started off, as soon as you arrive at the facility, it looks like any other facility. Once we got there, you have a nice reception area that's there, and after we did get to the reception area, the Chief Medical Examiner for Miami-Dade was there to give us the tour. And, Mr. Speaker, one of the first things that he pointed out to us upon arriving at the reception area was two rooms that are set off to the side. So, Speaker, this is what they call the family rooms. The way it works in Miami is that should there be a homicide or a deceased individual would arrive at the morgue, they try to contact the family to identify the deceased individual. Mr. Speaker, the family is first brought into a private room. This is a small room, some nice paintings, a couch, some chairs, and a side washroom off from it. And I asked the Chief Medical Examiner, we see on TV where if someone's brought in to identify a deceased person, where they're brought down to the actual morgue, they lift the sheet and ask the person to identify if the deceased person is their loved one. What was explained to us is that doesn't happen anymore. In this day and age in Miami, what they do is they take an actual photo of the deceased person, the face, and then they present that to the family within this private family room. Mr. Speaker, one of the main items that they stressed was respect for the family and respect for the deceased. And so in that facility, the families don't go anywhere near the morgue. They're not exposed to any unpleasant scents, any unpleasant sights, other than the photos that they may be shown, but there is a great deal of respect shown for the family. And there's 2 of these family rooms that exist at that facility. Mr. Speaker, we had the opportunity to go and we actually witnessed what they consider there to be a harvesting of organs, and a harvesting of tissue, in fact, is what we're exposed to. And we learned that Miami-Dade has one of the highest rates of organ donation of anywheres in North America. And Mr. Speaker, on the flip side, we learned that Nova Scotia has one of the lowest rates of organ or tissue donation of anywheres in North America, which is something I believe that we all need to work, both with the Minister of Justice and I believe all legislators, to bring a greater awareness to Nova Scotians on the importance of organ donation, tissue donation, and certainly with the Department of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations that does some of the awareness through their driver's licenses. It's a great thing, but obviously we need to do more because the numbers are just not there. And Mr. Speaker, when you hear some of the success stories that are out there from the organ donation, and it has even been suggested, Mr. Speaker, and apparently I believe in one country, one of the European countries, there's a reverse onus, which basically it is assumed that everyone's an organ donor unless you actually say you do not wish to be an organ donor. And I thank the Leader of the Official Opposition for his assistance here, and he actually joined me on that trip. But Mr. Speaker, we got to see some of the harvesting of tissue. We had the opportunity to see some of the forensic labs that are used. And lo and behold, Mr. Speaker, we were actually brought into the morgue itself. Now, Mr. Speaker, we arrived on a Monday morning. Overnight, 14 bodies arrived at the morgue in one day. 14 that were there for the purpose of an autopsy. Mr. Speaker, the rate of crime in Miami-Dade is overwhelming and something that's beyond belief for us here in Nova Scotia. But the amount and the specific steps that they take in evidence gathering as part of the autopsy process and the minute that the body arrives, Mr. Speaker, was nothing short of amazing. And having a legal background, myself, the Leader of the Official Opposition, some of the staff from the Department of Justice, you certainly appreciate the importance of evidence gathering and how essential it is not to make any errors in the continuity of evidence. And certainly in Miami, we had the opportunity to see that. And even while we were in the morgue, we were brought into a room where the bodies were exposed. And one autopsy was actually taking place, Mr. Speaker. And again, it's not a pleasant thing to see. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but for anyone who suggested that this was just a trip to get down to Miami, after seeing what we saw and being exposed to what we saw, I don't think anyone would consider that to be a vacation. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, you could read all the documents you want. It would not give you the learning experience that we were given by touring that facility. Because when you walk into that room, when you see what is done, when you smell what you have to smell there, Speaker, you have such a better appreciation of this work and the importance it is to forensic science, the importance it is to the respect to the deceased, respect to the families. So, Mr. Speaker, we had the opportunity the next day to actually visit the crime lab. Now, this was more the CSI type portion of it. We got to see gunshot analysis, DNA analysis. We were actually brought into a vault, or shown a vault, I should say, where they have a collection of all different types of weapons that could be used as part of their gunshot analysis and some of the guns that they have seized. Mr. Speaker, I've had the opportunity in going door to door to see some impressive gun collections in my own riding of Richmond from avid hunters and avid gamesmen. But when you walk into that room and you see, I believe it was well into the hundreds, the amount of weapons that were in that facility. Mr. Speaker, and the nature of the weapons. There was actually an anti-tank rifle that had been seized from a home in Miami. Now, Mr. Speaker, why would anyone want an anti-tank rifle in their home? Who are they looking for? What are they expecting to do with an anti-tank rifle? Mr. Speaker, this rifle was taller than I am. Not that I'm very tall, but certainly it was almost 7 feet in length. And yet the assault rifles that were there, it was almost like watching an old war movie. And when I asked one of the officers that was there at the facility, I said, where would you get this type of weapon? Who is selling these weapons? And he said, with a proper gun possession card, you can go buy it at any local shop here in Miami. And when the look of amazement came on my face, he looked at me and he said, "You're Canadian, right?" And I obviously, it was enough for him to understand why we have a complete lack of understanding of the gun culture that exists in the United States, but certainly in Miami-Dade. But, Mr. Speaker, that's another issue that we need to have a discussion as a province as well. Currently, a great deal of our crime lab work is done in Ottawa. It's sent from Nova Scotia up to Ottawa and done in the RCMP crime labs in Ottawa. One of the issues that was raised is, can we justify the construction of our own crime lab facility here in Nova Scotia and possibly look at working with PEI, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, or other provinces and having the work done here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, this could create employment. This could be a quicker turnaround time for some of the forensic science and the here in Nova Scotia, and I think it's something to look at. And again, I want to commend the Minister of Justice for exposing us to this discussion. I think it's something that we need to have as a province. Mr. Speaker, we had the chance to see the Miami facility, which again is the prototype. It's a world-class facility, and obviously we would not be looking to build something of that scale here in Nova Scotia. But after having seen that, and I want to commend the Department of Justice and Chief Medical Examiner Matt Bowes, because rather than showing us what we have here in Nova Scotia first, he showed us what was in Miami first, and then a couple of weeks ago we went to see what we have as a morgue and forensic facility here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, needless to say, while Miami was an eye-opening experience for us, I believe that what we have here in Nova Scotia was a disappointing experience for us. Because unfortunately, and it's not something I believe any government should be blamed for, I believe as a province we have failed, all of us, to pay the attention necessary to forensic science here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I won't go into detail of what we have here in Nova Scotia, but needless to say, it is extremely disappointing. And more importantly, Mr. Speaker, I believe it's fair to say, and I speak on my own behalf, the Leader of the Official Opposition will be able to speak for himself, but I think it's fair to say that our caucus would certainly be very supportive of government investments to improve the morgue facility and forensic science facility here in Nova Scotia, because there is no excuse for us to continue with the facilities we have today. Mr. Speaker, while I mentioned the situation in Miami about the respect for the deceased and respect for the family, in Nova Scotia, we don't have a family room. We expect grieving family members to wait in the lobby area at the entrance of the Mackenzie building, where employees are walking by, it's business, it's traffic, and grieving family members are left there to wait. No privacy. From there, Mr. Speaker, right off the elevators, you open a door and you're into the morgue facility, right off of the reception, not in the basement, on the main floor. Upon opening that door, Mr. Speaker, words cannot describe the scent. There's no means of describing it. I don't think anyone would have ever had any scent, anything near the scent that is there. As soon as you walk in, the first thing you see is the refrigerated unit where the bodies are kept. Further down the hallway, Mr. Speaker, is where there are two tables, there are two rooms where they actually do the autopsies. But Mr. Speaker, where the forensic unit is, that section, is also the hallway that is used by employees to access the Tim Hortons at the Dixon building. So it is a common occurrence for employees to be walking back and forth in the morgue after going to pick up coffee and muffins. Now, Mr. Speaker, what respect is that for the dead? What respect is that for the families? Because where is the family room in Nova Scotia? It's actually right next to the refrigerated unit, where you walk into a small room that has a curtain on the wall. They open up that curtain, and you're looking into the refrigerated unit, and the sheet is lifted. In that room, there are boxes and there are buckets that are up to the wall. That is where a family in Nova Scotia is asked to go grieve if they have to go identify a deceased loved one. Mr. Speaker, no Nova Scotian should be put through that. And I believe that I want to commend Chief Medical Examiner Matt Bowes, who has made it such a priority of the respect for the family, but even on top of that, the respect for the deceased. And the fact that we do not have appropriate facilities here in Nova Scotia. And again, it's an issue where most Nova Scotians may be saying it doesn't impact me. And I hope it never impacts any Nova Scotians. But in reality, it does. And families are asked to come in, and families are asked to do identification. And I believe that as legislators, we wouldn't want it to happen to any of our family members. And therefore, I believe we have a duty to encourage the government, and I believe in this case, give our support to making the changes necessary to have proper facilities constructed here in the province. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad I had this opportunity, because I've told Dr. Matt Bowes that I would certainly give the support of our caucus. I've told the minister that we would give the support, and today I have the opportunity on the record to indicate that our caucus would certainly be in strong support of any government investments in the very near future, I would hope, towards the construction of a new forensic facility here in Nova Scotia, a new morgue facility, better family rooms, better technology, not only to allow and not only to respect the families, but certainly we have to make sure that, as I spoke of in Miami, that we have the proper continuity of evidence here in Nova Scotia, that the chief medical examiner and his employees are able to do their work, so that at the end of the day, that we don't find ourselves in a situation where someone who may be guilty of a crime would be found not guilty by the courts because of a lack of continuity of evidence, or that the chief medical examiner or his employees weren't able to do their work appropriately due to the lack of facilities and the lack of equipment that they have. So, Mr. Speaker, again, it's not a topic that's pleasant to speak about. It wasn't a pleasant experience to have to go visit morgues, but it certainly gave me a much greater appreciation of this line of work, a much better appreciation for the work done by Dr. Matt Bowes and his entire staff and the pathologists throughout Nova Scotia who do this work in some of our medical hospitals around the province. And certainly I think it's something that we as legislators have a big role to play in giving our support. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to finish off by saying again, the fact that the minister brought both the Leader of Official Opposition, myself, with him and his staff. If the minister on Tuesday's budget, if he had not done that, and on Tuesday's budget, the Minister of Finance would have announced so many millions of dollars going towards a construction new facility, I can certainly tell you I would not have been in a position to be able to tell Nova Scotians whether that was a wise investment or a wise use of their tax dollars, because I would not have the background or the knowledge of what takes place in forensic science here in Nova Scotia. And I don't believe that the Leader of Official Opposition would have been in a better situation either. But by doing that, now I can stand and I can be able to tell the people of Richmond County and be able to tell Nova Scotians that this is a wise expenditure of tax dollars and something that should be supported. And I think that's a message that should be given to all of the ministers in government, that by including the opposition in many of these discussions, it does give us the opportunity to be able to have a better understanding, to ask the questions beforehand, and when decisions are being made and this House is being asked to support the expenditure of funds, we are in a position to actually be able to do so. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe I've certainly gone longer than I expected, but being this is the second day in the House, I believe I've gone on long enough. But with the administration of justice, there's so much that we could talk about. And as I mentioned before, if the justice critic for the official opposition is serious in his complaints about certain sections of the bill that should be severed and should stand on their own, I again reiterate my willingness to meet with him and his caucus to look at whether certain provisions of this bill should be cut out, and ask the minister to bring them as standalone legislation if he feels that passionate that there's a need for discussion on those specific items. I've made that complaint before, and I certainly would be willing to entertain that if that is something that he wishes to pursue. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to many other interveners on this specific piece of legislation, and look forward as well to it being able to move forward to law amendments where, as always, we look to Nova Scotians and many people who are working in the specific fields that are listed here in this bill to indicate to us whether there are any concerns or any other possible changes that we should be looking at through this specific legislation. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I would end my remarks on Bill number 124. Merci.
Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if we are looking for the reasons that this House sits fewer days in any other legislature than Canada, you could look at this bill as part of the reason. It's not the whole reason, but it's part of the reason, because the bill is entitled An Act Respecting the Administration of Justice, and there might be one section in it that actually has to do with the administration of justice. This might as well be called the Odds and Ends Act, the Bits and Pieces Act, the Miscellaneous Stuff Act, that we couldn't think of where else to put it. Mr. Speaker, it's just a whole bunch of things that have no connection to each other, all put in under the title the Administration of Justice Act. And what that does, of course, is it short-circuits the legislative process, whereas each one of these items could be and should be its own separate bill, where there would be adequate notice to the public, opportunity to appear before the Public Accounts Committee, just a little bit more public knowledge about what's actually in the bill. Instead, we have this omnibus bill, but we complain about this every year, and if you look back in the record, you'll see us complaining about it, you'll see the Liberals complaining about it, but they do the same thing year after year, Mr. Speaker. And so this bill will hurry its way through the process. And I'm interested that the justice critic for the Liberal Party suggests that they are willing to join with us in breaking this bill up. It would be very interesting to talk to the Liberal Party about how that might be done. But of course, part of the government's strategy in doing this is precisely that if the bill is stalled or parts of it are defeated, the government simply points to the better parts of the bill and says, oh, well, the opposition must be against those, when really what we're after is a proper legislative process that respects the processes of this House. And Mr. Speaker, for example, to give you an example of the kind of thing that should not be an administration of justice bill, you just have to look at the first page. What on earth is a provision that amends the Bee Industry Act doing in a bill on the administration of justice? Mr. Speaker, did the minister hear about a problem that we have with swarmings and get the wrong idea? Mr. Speaker, it seems pretty clear to me, after combing through the bill, that this section and many others need to be hived off. Then, Mr. Speaker, then we might have a honey of a bill. And we might be able to create a little bit of buzz around the bill, Mr. Speaker. Now, I don't mean this to be... I don't mean that to be a stinging rebuke to the minister,
please.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. On a point of order, the Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Speaker, I'd just like to point out to the honourable member that probably the beekeepers do not appreciate this stinging rebuke.
That is definitely not a point of order. We'll return to the honourable member that has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Hants East for writing that part of my speech. But seriously, Mr. Speaker, the bee industry is fundamentally important to the agricultural industry. They're suffering some real challenges with parasites and disease that are killing off colonies. But instead of having a standalone bill that we could debate in which we could have some input, there's an amendment to the Bee Industry Act in part of an administration of justice bill. Now, why on earth is that in an administration of justice bill? And you could go down the list and say the same thing. What does it have to do with the administration of justice? Now, that particular provision has to do with the delegation of the minister's authority, which means the minister will no longer be dealing personally with certain matters under the Bee Industry Act. Now, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? Is that something the industry supports? Is that something the industry opposes? Is this another step down the road of ministers shielding themselves from responsibilities that decisions are made in their department, Mr. Speaker? And Mr. Speaker, when we have a government which on the immigration file pointed the finger squarely at civil servants and said it was them who made mistakes, Mr. Speaker, we have something to worry about here about ministerial responsibility and ministerial accountability. These things are worthy of debate in the House with a standalone bill, but instead it's just one more section crammed into an administration of justice bill. Let me turn to another completely unrelated section of the bill, Mr. Speaker, the amendments to the Consumer Reporting Act, where at least the government has found the right problem but are proposing the wrong solution. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is a bill that will be forthcoming from this caucus on the same subject, but at least we have the right solution to the right problem. And it has to do with whether people can get credit reports over the internet, which in this day and age of identity theft is an important issue. But the reason that Nova Scotians can't get credit reports over the internet is the Consumer Reporting Act currently says that those reports must be provided free of charge. And the consumer reporting companies say, we're not providing them free of charge, therefore if you live in Nova Scotia you can't have them. The obvious answer is to say that if somebody orders one of the reports over the internet, that the company can charge for it. But what the government is proposing here is that the providing free reports is going to be eliminated completely, whether it's over the internet or otherwise, when the existing system of having the right to have a free credit report by mail, which I've done myself, and the system works fine, that the government is proposing to eliminate that in the hope that they can negotiate a deal with the credit reporting industry. That is not the right solution. So we can anticipate that further along in the process, Mr. Speaker, that this caucus will be proposing an amendment to that particular provision. Then we get into other completely unrelated provisions of the bill, changing the Executive Council Act, Mr. Speaker, changing the names of departments. And I'm going to be saving the thrust of my remarks on that for debate on other bills, Mr. Speaker. But surely, Mr. Speaker, it will make Nova Scotians roll their eyes to see things like the creation of a standalone Department of Environment. Because, Mr. Speaker, we used to have one of those. And who was it who eliminated it? It was them, Mr. Speaker. It was this government that eliminated the standalone Department of Environment, because at that phase in their history, the emphasis was on efficiency, economy, small cabinet, and so they merged different departments together. Mr. Speaker, now, not very many years later, they're splitting the departments apart again and say, look at us, pat us on the back, aren't we great? We're creating a standalone Department of Labor and a standalone Department of Environment. We already had those until they eliminated them, and now they're creating them again. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know one group of people who supports this government. Those are the people who print business cards and signs outside government offices, because they're all going to have to be changed again. All those business cards that were printed when they put the departments together are now going to have to be thrown out and a whole new bunch printed with the new name of the department. But is there going to be any change in policy? The Department of Environment is now going to be split off from the Department of Labor, but they're still going to have the same minister. Mr. Speaker, and I guess we'll have to wait to the budget on Tuesday to see whether there's going to be any increase of resources, but it seems unlikely. It's the same thing that they did with agriculture and fisheries, which used to be separate, and then they put them together as part of their efficiency kick, and then they split them apart again, but they had one minister for both, Mr. Speaker, at least at the beginning. And it's the same with the Department of Environment. The issues in the Department of Environment have nothing to do with the name. They have to do with the management of the responsibility. And in Chapter 3 of the latest Auditor General's report, there is a stinging rebuke to the government and to the Department of Environment in particular about how the Enforcement and Compliance Division of the Department of Environment is not working. People have lost confidence in the ability of that department to enforce compliance with the existing environmental laws. And what is the government's response? It's to change the name of the department. I will have more to say on that, Mr. Speaker, when another bill comes before the House that creates or recreates or reestablishes a standalone Department of Environment. We find also, Mr. Speaker, a mandate for the Office of Communications Nova Scotia, which, as we all know, has existed for a number of years. Well, Mr. Speaker, what mandate was it operating with if it hadn't had legislation up until now? It reminds me of another remark of the Auditor General, who pointed out that the Office of Health Promotion has no legislative mandate, no strategic plan, Mr. Speaker, after existing for, it must be at least a couple of years now. So there's all these units of government that get created in order to create what I would refer to, Mr. Speaker, as illusions of progress. When looked at objectively and independently, there are serious, serious issues of management. And that is no more true, Mr. Speaker, than it is in the Department of Environment. The revisions to the Public Trustee Act, which have nothing to do with anything that I've just talked about, are really important fundamental changes in the law governing when somebody's affairs can be looked after by the public trustee. And in these days of an aging population, of more people who are not competent in the legal sense of the word to look after their own affairs, these things are fundamentally important. This deserves a standalone piece of legislation that referred to a committee of the legislature for hearings from the public so that we know what the problems are, what the options are, what the possible solutions are, because there are many people who would have a great deal to say about when the public trustee should or should not be able to step in, and instead we get something jammed into an Administration of Justice Act, Mr. Speaker, which will race through this House. That's not the way to deal with those kind of issues. The Small Claims Court Act amendment, Mr. Speaker, just about the only thing in the entire Act that truly has to do with the administration of justice corrects an error that perhaps could have and should have been caught back in December when we amended the Small Claims Court Act in the first place. And all this does is make a different section of the Act align with something that we've already done. But that is the only clause in the whole bill that has to do with the administration of justice, Mr. Speaker. And so we say it year after year, the government should not be introducing legislation this way, but year after year they do it. Year after year, Mr. Speaker, this House has short sittings, and there are many reasons for that, but this is one of them. This is not the way legislation should go through the House. Mr. Speaker, my colleague from the Liberal Party used most of his speech to talk about deficiencies in the administration of justice, properly speaking. And I'd like to take some time to follow on that theme by remarking on one of my own. And now, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that is tough on crime but soft on details. Mr. Speaker, in the last few weeks, we have seen the threat of illegal strikes by prison guards. We've had the threat of disturbances in our prisons. We've had a high-profile escape. In the past several months, we've had 3 mistaken releases of prisoners that we know about. And, Mr. Speaker, the case that I want to talk about that ought to be in this bill but isn't has to do with a murder that was committed in my constituency 3 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker. Early in the morning of April the 5th, a young man was stabbed to death in my constituency. And the accused is a younger man, a 17-year-old, Mr. Speaker. And of course, neither I nor anybody in this House would purport to say whether that young man is guilty or not of the crime. But here is the essential fact for today's proceedings, Mr. Speaker. That young man who now stands accused of murder was under a curfew imposed by the court. Whether he did the murder or not, he should not have been in that place. But that young man knows, as so many people under curfew or house arrest know, that there is no practical enforcement of that kind of court order. And if that young man had believed that if he left the house where he was ordered by the court to be, if he had believed that he would be caught, he was likely to be caught, then it is possible that he would have stayed home that night and he would not now stand accused of murder and another young man would still be alive. Mr. Speaker, but instead of that, we have an administration of justice bill that has very little to do with the administration of justice. And what we find out in the Public Accounts Committee, Mr. Speaker, is that the GPS tracking system, which was much vaunted by the government 2 years ago, 10 days before an election, the government announced a 1-year pilot program and a contract awarded to a Nova Scotia company which in turn subcontracted with a Nebraska company for the GPS tracking of offenders who were on house arrest or on curfew, Mr. Speaker. That was 2 years ago. They announced a one-year pilot program. And since then, there has been not one word in public about how that program is going. And what we find out, Mr. Speaker, in the Public Accounts Committee is, in fact, the Nova Scotia company to which the contract had been awarded withdrew from the contract in frustration with the way that it was being administered by this government. That it was not being dealt with the way the government had